Is it true that Moses never entered the Promised Land?
Yes, according to the Bible, Moses, who was 80 years old when he led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, never entered the promised land of Canaan. After parting the Red Sea, which had swallowed up the Egyptian soldiers who pursued the Israelites as they fled, Moses led the people into the desert, embarking on what turned out to be a 40-year journey to Canaan. During this time, which is also described as 40 years of wandering, the Israelites lived under harsh conditions. This led them to distrust a God they could not see and to challenge Moses' authority. But Moses frequently appealed to God for help, and the Bible reports that he received it. In one instance, Numbers 20:22-12, God directed Moses to get water for the parched Israelites and their livestock by ordering a rock to yield its water. But instead of speaking to the rock, Moses struck it twice with his staff. Even though water gushed out of the rock, Moses had failed to follow God's instructions. Therefore, God later said to Moses, "Because you were not faithful to me, you shall not lead this community into the land I will give them." Eventually the Israelites reached Canaan, ancient Palestine. But God did not allow Moses to enter the promised land. He only viewed it from atop Mount Pisgah, in present-day Jordan, before he died.
What was the Great Famine?
Typically the term refers to the Great Irish Famine, which began in 1845. That year crops failed across Europe, resulting in widespread hunger and disease, claiming 2.5 million lives. The famine was especially severe in Ireland, where many peasants exported their grain and millet and depended on potatoes for their own sustenance. The failure of the potato crop in 1845 was the 20th in Ireland since 1727. And it marked the beginning of the Great Famine, which lasted into 1848 due to more disastrous crop failures each successive year. The crops had failed due to blight, previously unknown to Ireland, which was caused by a microscopic organism. Fungus, believed to have been introduced by a ship from North America. British charity and government relief did little to alleviate the suffering. The resulting famine was responsible for a drastic decline in the Irish population due both to death and emigration. Between 700,000 and 1 million people died in Ireland, and nearly 2 million people left the country in search of a better life elsewhere. Other severe, or great, famines include one in 1769 in Bengal. The disaster claimed the lives of 10 million Asian Indians, one-third of the population. In 1878 up to 20 million Chinese people died as a 2-year drought held Asia in its grips, causing widespread crop failures. It is still considered the worst famine in history.
How did America get its name?
America is derived from the name of Italian navigator Amerigo Vespucci, 1454–1512, who took part in several early voyages to the New World. Vespucci had been a merchant in service of the Medici family in Florence, and later moved to Spain, where he worked for the company that outfitted the ships for Christopher Columbus's 1451–1506 second and third voyages. He sailed with the Spaniards on several expeditions, in 1497, 1499, 1501, and 1503. Though scholars today question his role as an explorer, in a work by German geographer Martin Waldseemüller, c. 1470 c. 1520, published in 1507, the author credited Vespucci with realizing that he had actually arrived in a new world, not in the Far East as other explorers, including Columbus, had believed. Thus, Waldseemüller suggested the new lands be named America after Amerigo Vespucci. For his part, Waldseemüller was led to believe this by Vespucci himself, who had written to Lorenzo de' Medici in 1502 or 1503, relaying his discovery of a new continent and vividly describing it. About a year later, the letter was published under the title Mundus Novus, New World, which was translated and published in future editions. The designation America was used again in 1538 by Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator. Gerhard Kremer, 1512–1594. Today the term in the singular refers to either continent in the Western Hemisphere and sometimes specifically to the United States. In the plural, it refers to all of the lands of the Western Hemisphere, including North and South America and the West Indies.
What are the origins of slavery in America?
The roots of slavery in North America date back to about 1400, when the Europeans arrived in Africa. At first, the result of African contact with Europeans was positive, opening trade routes and expanding markets. Europeans profited from Africa's rich mineral and agricultural resources and for a while abided by local laws governing their trade. Africans benefited from new technologies and products brought by the Europeans. But the relationship between the two cultures soon turned disastrous as the Europeans cast their attention on a decidedly different African resource, the people themselves. As the Portuguese in West and East Africa began trading in human lives and the Dutch in South Africa clashed with the native people who, once displaced by the wars, became servants and slaves. Other Europeans began calculating the profits that could be made in the slave trade. By the end of the 1400s, Europeans had landed in the New World. Soon Europe's established and emerging powers vied for control of territories in the new lands of North and South America and the West Indies. The Spaniards, Portuguese, Dutch, English, and Swedes all made claims in the Western Hemisphere and began setting up colonies. By the mid-1600s, triangular patterns of trade emerged. The most common route began on Africa's west coast, where ships picked up slaves. The second stop was the Caribbean islands, predominantly the British and French West Indies, where the slaves were sold to plantation owners and traders used the profits to purchase sugar, molasses, tobacco, and coffee. These raw materials were then transported north to the third stop, New England, where a rum industry was thriving. Their ships were loaded with the spirits before traders made the last leg of their journey back across the Atlantic to Africa's west coast, where the process began again. Other trade routes operated as follows: 1. Manufactured goods were transported from Europe to the African coast. Slaves to the West Indies, and sugar, tobacco, and coffee transported back to Europe, where the route began again, and 2. Lumber, cotton, and meat were transported from the colonies to southern Europe. Wine and fruits to England, and manufactured goods to the colonies, where the route began again. There were as many possible routes as there were ports and demand for goods. The tragic result of the triangular trade was the transport of an estimated 10 million black Africans. Sold into slavery, these human beings were often chained below deck and allowed only brief, if any, periods of exercise during the transatlantic crossing, which came to be called the Middle Passage. Conditions for the slaves were brutal and improved only slightly when traders realized that should slaves perish during the long journey across the ocean, it would adversely affect their profits upon arrival in the West Indies. After economies in the islands of the Caribbean crashed at the end of the 1600s, many slaves were sold to plantation owners on the North American mainland, initiating another tragic trade route. The slave trade was abolished in the 1800s, putting an end to the forced migration of Africans to the Western Hemisphere.
Who was Montezuma?
Montezuma, or Moctezuma, was the name of two rulers of the Aztec Indians in Mexico. Montezuma I ruled an area that extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He is credited with enlarging Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, which is today Mexico City. He died in 1469, but 3 years earlier was succeeded by his nephew, Montezuma II, 1466 to 1520. Who is the Montezuma most people are familiar with, since it was during his reign that the Aztecs came into contact with and were eventually conquered by the Spaniards under explorer Hernán Cortés, 1485 to 1547. In 1519 Montezuma tried to persuade Cortés not to come to Mexico City, but Cortés and his troops marched inland anyway. The Aztecs rose up to fight the Spaniards, but Montezuma was wounded as he addressed his warriors. He died a few days later, on June 30, 1520, 1 year before Mexico City fell to the Spaniards.
Besides the native peoples, what discoveries did the Europeans make in the New World?
The new lands of the Western Hemisphere yielded many plants unknown in Europe. On Christopher Columbus's first voyage in 1492 he became the first European to discover maize, corn, sweet potatoes, capsicums, peppers, plantains, and pineapples. Subsequent expeditions found potatoes, wild rice, squash, tomatoes, cacao, chocolate beans, peanuts, cashews, and tobacco. These plants, many of which had been developed and cultivated by the American Indians, were carried back to Europe, and their cultivation spread to suitable climates throughout the world.
Were the Pilgrims explorers?
The Pilgrims were early settlers who sought religious freedom and self-government in the New World. Since theirs was a religious journey, they described themselves as pilgrims. In fact, they were separatists, Protestants who separated from the Anglican Church to set up their own church. In 1609 they fled their home in Intrebari, England, and settled in Holland. Fearing their children would lose contact with their own culture, becoming assimilated into the Dutch culture, the group decided to voyage to America to establish their own community. In 1620 they arrived on the rocky western shore of Cape Cod Bay, Massachusetts. Their transatlantic crossing had taken 66 days aboard the Mayflower. 2 babies were born during the passage, bringing the number of settlers to 102, only some 35 of whom were pilgrims, the rest were merchants. On November 21 the Pilgrims drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement by which the 41 signatories, the men aboard the Mayflower, formed a body politic that was authorized to enact and enforce laws for the community. Religious leader John Carver, 1576–1621, was voted governor. Though their colonial charter from the London Company specified they were to settle in Virginia, they decided to establish their colony at Cape Cod, well outside the company's jurisdiction. By December 25 the Pilgrims had chosen the site for their settlement and began building at New Plymouth. The first year was difficult and the Pilgrims faced many hardships. 35 more colonists arrived aboard the Fortune, putting a strain on already limited resources. Sicknesses such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and scurvy claimed many lives, including that of Governor Carver. And the merchants in the group challenged the purity of the settlement. Having secured a new patent from the Council of New England in June 1621, the lands of New Plymouth Colony were held in common by both the Pilgrims and the merchants. But this communal system of agriculture proved unsuccessful, and in 1624 William Bradford (1590–1657), who had succeeded Carver as governor, granted each family its own parcel of land. The Wampanoag Indians, who had previously occupied the land settled by the Pilgrims, proved friendly and were helpful advisors in agricultural matters. In 1626 the Pilgrims bought out the merchants' shares and claimed the colony for themselves. Though they were inexperienced at government before arriving in America and had not been formally educated, the Pilgrims successfully governed themselves according to the scriptures. And Plymouth Colony remained independent until 1691, when it became part of Massachusetts Bay Colony founded by the Puritans.
What did manifest destiny have to do with the expansion of the United States?
The doctrine of manifest destiny emerged in the United States in the early 1800s and by the 1840s had taken firm hold. Adherents believed that Americans had a God-given right and duty to expand their territory and influence throughout North America. Manifest destiny was a rallying cry for expansionism and prompted rapid U.S. acquisition of territory during the 1800s. The acquisitions began in 1803 with the purchase of Louisiana Territory from France. In 1819 Florida and the southern strip of Alabama and Mississippi, collectively called the Old Southwest, were acquired from Spain in the Adams-Nice Treaty. In 1845 Texas was annexed after white settlers fought for and declared freedom from Mexico, forming the Republic of Texas and petitioning the Union for statehood. In 1846 the western border between Canada and the United States was determined to lie at 49 degrees north latitude, the northern boundary of what is today Washington State, in 1848 by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States secured New Mexico and California after winning the Mexican War. 1846–48, and in 1853 southern Arizona was acquired from Mexico in the Gadsden Purchase. With the 1853 agreement the United States had completed the acquisition of territory that makes up the contiguous states. The expansionist doctrine of manifest destiny was again invoked as justification for the Spanish-American War. 1898, which was fought over the issue of freeing Cuba from Spain. Spain lost the war, dissolving its empire. Cuba achieved independence, though it was occupied by U.S. troops for 3 years. By the close of the 19th century, manifest destiny had resulted in U.S. acquisition of the outlying territories of Alaska, Hawaiian Islands, Midway Islands, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, Wake Island, American Samoa, Panama Canal Zone, and U.S. Virgin Islands.
What does Messiah mean?
Messiah is the Hebrew word for anointed one. In the broadest sense, a Messiah is the professed or accepted leader of some hope or cause. Jesus is believed by Christians to be the Messiah whose arrival was foretold by the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament. For example, in Isaiah 9:6, it states that a child will be born among the people. A son is given to us, he will bear the symbol of dominion, and his title will be Wonderful Counselor. Mighty Hero, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace.
What are the four horsemen of the apocalypse?
The four horsemen of the apocalypse are allegorical figures mentioned in chapter 6 of Revelation. Also called the Revelation of St. John the Divine. The chapter describes a scroll which contains 7 seals and is held in God's right hand. When the first 4 of the seals are opened, the 4 horsemen appear, each on a different colored horse. There are various interpretations of these allegorical figures. But the rider on the white horse is believed to represent conquest, or the return of Christ. The rider on the red horse is believed to represent war. The rider on the black horse, famine, and the pale horse, death. Some believe these hardships to be signs of the end of the world. The symbol of the 4 horsemen has appeared throughout art and literature.
How were the Puritans different from the Pilgrims?
The Puritans who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony were, like the Pilgrims, religious Protestants. Both sects protested the Anglican Church. But while the Pilgrims separated from the Church, the Puritans wished to purify it. Their religious movement began in England during the 1500s. And they were influenced by the teachings of reformer John Calvin, 1509 to 1564. They also had strong feelings about government, maintaining that people can only be governed by contract, such as a constitution, which limits the power of a ruler. When King James I, 1566 to 1625, ascended the throne of England in 1603, he was the first ruler of the house, royal family, of Stuart. The Stuart monarchs, particularly James's successor, King Charles I, 1600 to 1649, tried to enforce absolute adherence to the High Church of Anglicanism, and viewed the Puritan agitators as a threat to the authority of the crown. Persecuted by the throne, groups of Puritans fled England for the New World. One group was granted a corporate charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company, 1629. Unlike other such contracts, which provided the framework for establishing colonies in America, this one did not require the stockholders to hold their meetings in England. Stockholders who made the voyage across the Atlantic would become voting citizens in their own settlement. The board of directors would form the legislative assembly, and the company president, Puritan leader John Winthrop, 1588 to 1649, would become the governor. In 1630 they settled in what is today Boston and Salem, Massachusetts, establishing a Puritan commonwealth. By 1643 more than 20,000 Puritans arrived in Massachusetts, in what is called the Great Migration. Puritans also settled in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Virginia during the colonial period.
What was the Trail of Tears?
The Trail of Tears was the government-enforced western migration of the American Indians, which began March 25, 1838. As an increasing number of white settlers moved inland from the coastal areas, they laid claim to Indian homelands. Conflicts ensued. The government's solution was to relocate the Indians to make room for the pioneers. As many as 17,000 members of the Cherokee Nation were forced from tribal lands in Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, and were escorted west by federal troops under the command of General Winfield Scott. 1786 to 1866, along an 800-mile trail that followed the Tennessee-Ohio, Mississippi, and Arkansas rivers to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, north of the Red River. The journey took between 93 and 139 days, and the movement westward was called the Trail of Tears, not only because it was a journey the native people did not wish to make, to a place where they did not wish to go, but because an estimated 4,000 people, mostly infants, children, and the elderly, died en route. The deaths were caused by sickness, including measles, whooping cough, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. Escorted in waves, it was a full year, spring of 1839, before the Cherokee had been relocated. Some 1,000 had refused to leave their tribal lands in the southeast. The forced migration thus resulted in the fragmentation and weakening of the tribe.
Are apostles and disciples the same thing?
No. The apostles were the 12 followers chosen by Jesus, see 6b.cc AD 30. As described in the New Testament of the Bible. The term apostle is also used to identify other early missionaries, such as Barnabas and Paul. Saul, who in Acts 13:2-3 are singled out by the Holy Spirit to be missionaries. A disciple is any follower of Jesus. Therefore, all the apostles were disciples. But not all disciples were apostles.
Why did people first believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah?
In his lifetime, Jesus of Nazareth, c. 6b.cc AD 30, was believed to be the Messiah for many reasons. These reasons are explained in detail in the New Testament, particularly in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. First, Jesus was thought to have been miraculously conceived by Mary, a virgin. In Luke 2:8-20, an angel is described as having spoken to shepherds tending their fields, telling them that in this night in the city of David, a Savior is born unto you, a Messiah, the Lord. And goes on to say that the sign of the Messiah is that they will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. Also in Luke 2:36-38, a prophetess arrives and proclaims Mary's baby. to be the child to all who were looking for the liberation of the Jews. Further, Jesus proclaimed himself to be the Son of God, as described, for example, in John 5:17-23. He demonstrated extraordinary healing powers, used parables to teach moral and spiritual ways, and carried a message of God's redeeming love. All of this was convincing enough that many, mostly the common people, became disciples or followers of Christ during his lifetime.
Who were the expansionists?
Not long after the colonies won the American Revolution, 1775-83, founding the United States of America. A nationalistic, super-patriotic spirit emerged in the hearts of many citizens of the new country. Eager to spread American ideals, many looked westward, northward, and southward to expand the territory of the Union beyond the original 13 states. These people were called expansionists. Not only did they favor the settlement of the frontier, but some advocated seizure of the Southwest. From Spain and later from Mexico, Florida, from Spain, the Louisiana Territory. From France, and the Northwest Territories, and even Canada, from Britain. By the 1840s, the doctrine of manifest destiny, stating that the United States had a God-given right and duty to expand its territory and influence throughout North America, took hold. The fires of expansionism were fanned by population growth during the 1800s. Pioneer settlement of the plains and the Old Northwest, the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, resulted in an increase in farmland and overall crop production. Yankee ingenuity resulted in inventions such as the cotton gin. 1793, and the McCormick Reaper, 1831, which improved the processing and harvesting of raw materials such as cotton and grain. And a continuous influx of immigrants from Europe supplied labor for the factories that had popped up across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. All these factors combined to create a rapid population growth. In the 2 decades between 1840 and 1860 alone, the population of the United States more than doubled, increasing from just over 17 million to more than 38 million. Though the eastern seaboard cities grew, a system of new canals, steamboats, roads, and railroads opened up the interior to increased settlement. By 1850, almost half the population lived outside the original 13 states. Though Canada, of course, remained in the hands of the British, the spirit of expansionism resulted in the United States' relatively speedy acquisition of North American territories that had belonged to Spain, Mexico, France, and the British. By 1853, the United States owned all the territory of the present-day contiguous states. And by the end of the century, it owned all the territory of its present-day states, including Alaska, purchased from Russia in 1867, and Hawaii, annexed in 1898.
What were the Dutch colonial holdings?
New Netherlands was the only Dutch colony on the North American mainland. It consisted of land surrounding the Hudson River, in present-day New York, and, later, the lower Delaware River, in New Jersey and Delaware. Explorers from the Netherlands first settled the area in about 1610. In 1624 the colony of New Netherlands was officially founded by the Dutch West India Company. On behalf of the company, in 1626 Dutch colonial official Peter Minuit, 1580–1638, purchased the island of Manhattan from the American Indians for an estimated $24 in trinkets. The colonial capital of New Amsterdam, present-day New York City, was established there. The Dutch held the colony until 1664 when it was conquered by the English under the direction of the Duke of York. James II, 1633–1701, the king's brother. The English sought the territory since New Netherlands separated its American holdings. Under British control the area was divided into two colonies, New Jersey and New York. During the colonial period the Netherlands also claimed the West Indies islands of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, called the Netherlands Antilles, which were administered separately from New Netherlands on the North American mainland.
What prompted widespread Irish emigration in the mid-1800s?
In 1845 Ireland's potato crop failed. Though crop failures in Europe were widespread at the time, the blight in Ireland was particularly hard-hitting because of the reliance on a single crop, potatoes, as the primary source of sustenance. The Great Famine that resulted lasted until 1848. The effect was a drastic decline in the Irish population due both to deaths and to emigration. Between 700,000 and 1 million people died in Ireland during the Great Famine. And between 1846 and 1854 alone, 1.75 million left the country in search of a better life elsewhere. 3/4 of those were headed to the United States. In the years after the Great Famine, experts determined that the blight of the late 1840s was caused by a fungus that was probably introduced to Ireland by a ship from North America, where there had been crop failures in the early 1840s. Sad irony that the very conduit that had likely borne the blight from North America to Ireland also carried immigrating Irish back to North American shores.
Why does controversy surround Christopher Columbus?
It is due in part to the fact that history wrongly billed Columbus 1451–1506 as the discoverer of the New World. The native peoples living in the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus were the true discoverers of these lands. These peoples had migrated thousands of years before, it is believed that as early as 50,000 BC. They came across the Bering Strait from Asia, and migrated southward, throughout North and South America, reaching Tierra del Fuego by 8000 BC. Therefore, it is correct to say that Columbus was the first European to discover the New World, and there he encountered its native peoples. But it was for his treatment of these native peoples that Columbus is a controversial figure. Columbus was called back from the New World twice, on his second and third voyages, to be investigated for his dealings with the Native Americans, including charges of cruelty. The first inquiry, 1496–97, turned out favorably for the explorer. His case was heard before the Spanish king, and charges were dismissed. However, troublesome rumors continued to follow Columbus, and in 1500 he and two of his brothers, Bartholomew and Diego, were arrested and sent back to Spain in chains. Though later released and allowed to continue his explorations, he would make one final trip to the New World. Christopher Columbus never regained his former stature, lost all honor, and died in poverty in the Spanish city of Valladolid in 1506.
Why was Jesus feared by the authorities?
There were two reasons Jesus, c. 6b.cc AD 30, was feared by Palestine's leaders. First, as an advocate of the poor. He was an outspoken critic of the privileged as well as of Palestine's oppressive Roman rulers. Palestine was part of the Roman province of Syria during the lifetime of Jesus. Jesus openly accused the ruling class of hypocrisy and injustices. Second, some feared that if Jesus was the Messiah, he would lead a revolution. So the governors viewed him and his teachings as a threat to their authority.
What were the 7 cities of Cibola?
The reference is to an area in present-day northern New Mexico that was thought by early Spanish explorers to contain vast treasures. One expedition in search of these legendary golden cities was that led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, c. 1510–1554, who sought to claim the riches for Spain. In 1540 he set out from North Galicia, a province northwest of Mexico City, with some 300 Spanish troops as well as some Indians. They made it into the region where Arizona and New Mexico lie today. There they encountered Zuni Indian settlements and believed these to be Cibola. The Spaniards captured the Zuni, who were the descendants of the Anasazi cliff dwellers that had settled the southwest as early as 10,000 BC. The Spaniards found no gold at the Zuni settlement. Separate expeditions set out, still hoping to locate riches in the area. They did not find any precious metals, but they did make some discoveries. They were the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon, to travel up the Rio Grande Valley, and to encounter several native peoples living in the region. In 1546 Coronado was accused of cruelty in his treatment of these peoples.
What was the goal of the Lewis and Clark expedition?
The expedition, which began in 1804 and took more than 2 years to complete, had 3 purposes. To chart a route that would be part of a passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. To trace the boundaries of the territory obtained in the Louisiana Purchase, and to lay claim to the Oregon Territory. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, was President of the United States at the time. And he believed that a route could be found between St. Louis and the West Coast. As early as 1801, Jefferson had conceived of the idea that the Missouri and Columbia rivers might be followed west, leading to the Pacific. The journey would also be a reconnaissance mission. Information would be collected about the vast region and communications would be set up with its inhabitants. On April 30, 1803, the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France. The purchase extended from the Mississippi River in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west, and from the Gulf of Mexico in the south to British America, Canada, in the north. Jefferson soon picked his private secretary, Virginia-born Meriwether Lewis, 1774 to 1809, to lead the westward expedition. Lewis then chose as his co-leader William Clark, 1770 to 1838, who, as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, had served General Anthony Wayne on the frontier, 1792 to 96. Beginning in the summer of 1803. Lewis and Clark undertook the necessary preparations for the overland journey. These included studying the classification of plants and animals, learning how to determine geographical position by observing the stars, and recruiting qualified men, mostly hunters and soldiers, for the expedition. On May 14, 1804, the Lewis and Clark expedition left St. Louis and headed up the Missouri River to its source. They then crossed the Great Divide and followed the Columbia River to its mouth, in present-day Oregon. At the Pacific Ocean, where they arrived in November 1805, 1.5 years after they had set out. They arrived back in St. Louis on September 23, 1806, having gathered valuable information on natural features of the country, including its flora, fauna, and the Indian tribes who lived there. The expedition had been helped by the addition, in what is now North Dakota, of a Shoshone Indian woman named Sacagawea, c. 1786 to 1812. Lewis and Clark had hired her husband, French-Canadian trader Toussaint Charbonneau, as an interpreter during the winter of 1804-05. Lewis and Clark thought that Sacagawea would be able to help them communicate with the Shoshone living in the Rocky Mountains, which she later did. Her brother was their chief. After the expedition, Lewis was made governor of Louisiana Territory, a post he served from 1807 to 1809. Clark resigned from the army in 1807 and became brigadier general of the militia and superintendent of Indian affairs for Louisiana Territory. In 1813 he became governor of the Missouri Territory, the Louisiana Territory less the state of Louisiana, which was organized as a state admitted into the Union in 1812, a post he held until 1821.
Where did Christopher Columbus first land in the New World?
Columbus, 1451 to 1506, set sail from Palos, in southwest Spain. On August 3, 1492, and he sighted land on October 12 that year. Going ashore, he named it San Salvador. Alternately called Wuddlings Island, today it is one of the Bahamas. With his fleet of 3 vessels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, Columbus then continued west and south, sailing along the north coast of Cuba and Haiti, which he named Hispaniola. When the Santa Maria ran aground, Columbus left a colony of about 40 men on the Haitian coast where they built a fort, which, being Christmas time, they named La Navidad. Navidad means Christmas in Spanish. In January 1493 he set sail for home, arriving back in Palos on March 15 with a few Indians, Native Americans, as well as some belts, aprons, bracelets, and gold on board. News of his successful voyage spread rapidly, and Columbus journeyed to Barcelona, Spain, where he was triumphantly received by Ferdinand and Isabella. On his second voyage, which he undertook on September 25, 1493, he sailed with a fleet of 17 ships and some 1,500 men. In November he reached Dominica, Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Upon returning to Haiti, Hispaniola, Columbus found the colony at La Navidad had been destroyed by natives. In December 1493 he made a new settlement at Isabela, present-day Dominican Republic, the eastern end of Hispaniola, which became the first European town in the New World. Before returning to Spain in 1496, Columbus also landed at Jamaica. On his third voyage, which he began in May 1498, Columbus reached Trinidad, just off the coast of South America. On his fourth and last trip he found the island of Martinique before arriving on the North American mainland at Honduras, in Central America. It was also on this voyage, in May 1502, that he sailed down to the Isthmus of Panama, finally believing himself to be near China. But Columbus suffered many difficulties, and in November 1504 he returned to Spain for good. He died 2 years later in poverty and neglect. He had, of course, never found the westward sea passage to the Indies in the Far East. Nevertheless, the Caribbean islands he discovered came to be known collectively as the West Indies. and the native peoples of North and South America came to be known collectively as Indians.
Did the Europeans introduce anything besides disease to the Americas?
Yes, in addition to certain diseases, which were accidentally imported into the New World by the early Europeans. The explorers brought with them many things that were previously unknown in the Americas. When Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506, landed at Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and Dominican Republic in the Caribbean, in 1492, he carried with him horses and cattle. These were the first seen in the Western Hemisphere. The American Indians had no beasts of burden prior to the arrival of the Europeans. In subsequent trips, Europeans introduced horses and livestock, including cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, and chickens, throughout South and North America. They later carried plants from Europe and the East back to the Americas, where they took hold. These included rice, sugar, indigo, wheat, and citrus fruits, all of which became established in the Western Hemisphere and became important crops during colonial times. With the exception of indigo, which was used as a fabric dye. These non-indigenous crops remain important to the countries of North and South America.
Were the Spaniards the first Europeans to reach North America after the Vikings?
No, that distinction goes to explorer John Cabot, c. 1451 to 1498, who in 1497 sailed westward from Bristol, England, in search of a trade route to the east. Cabot's story began in 1493, when Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506, returned to Spain from his New World voyage, claiming to have reached Asia. From the accounts of the trip, Cabot, who was himself a navigator, believed it was unlikely that Columbus had traveled that far. He did, however, believe it was possible, as did subsequent explorers, to find a route, a northwest passage that ran north of the landmass Columbus had discovered, and by which Asia could be reached. In 1495 the Italian Cabot, born Giovanni Caboto, took his family to England, and the following year, in March, appealed to King Henry VII, 1457 to 1509, for his endorsement in pursuing the plan. For his part, the king, who was well aware of the claims made by the Spanish and Portuguese who had sponsored their own explorations, was eager to find new lands to rule. And so he granted a patent, authorizing Cabot's expedition. Later that year, 1496, Cabot set sail. But problems on board the ship and foul weather forced him to turn back. The following spring, on May 20, 1497, he sailed again, in a small ship that had been christened Matthew. The crew of 20 included his son, Sebastian. On June 24, they sighted land and Cabot went ashore. While he saw signs of human habitation, he encountered no one. From reports of the trip, scholars believe Cabot had reached the coasts of present-day Maine, Nova Scotia, and probably Newfoundland. He then sailed home, returning to England on August 6. He reported to the king 6 days later and was given a reward, as well as authorization for a more sizable expedition, which he undertook in May 1498. This time Cabot set sail with 5 ships in his command. But the expedition was not heard from again.
Who were the conquistadors?
Conquistador is the Spanish word for conqueror. The Spaniards who arrived in North and South America in the late 1400s and early 1500s were just that, conquerors of the American Indians and their lands. In many cases, the Spaniards were the first Europeans to arrive in these lands, where they encountered native inhabitants including the Aztec of Mexico, the Maya of southern Mexico and Central America, and the Inca of western South America. By the mid-1500s these native peoples had been conquered, their populations decimated by the Spanish conquistadors. The conquest happened in 2 ways. First, the Spaniards rode on horseback and carried guns, while their native opponents were on foot and carried crude weapons such as spears and knives. And second, the European adventurers brought illnesses, such as smallpox and measles, to which the native populations of the Americas had no immunities, causing the people to become sick and die. By 1535 conquistadors such as Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475 to 1541, Hernan Cortés, 1485 to 1547, and Vasco Núñez de Balboa, 1475 to 1519, had claimed the southwestern United States, Mexico, Central America, and much of the West Indies, islands of the Caribbean, for Spain.
How old is Islam?
Islam, one of the world's largest religions, originated with the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, c. 570 to 632, during the early 600s. Muhammad was born in Mecca, in present-day Saudi Arabia, and was orphaned at the age of 6. He was raised by relatives, who trained him as a merchant. When he was 25 years old he married a wealthy widow, Khadija, who bore him several children. In about 610, Muhammad began having visions in which he was called upon by God, Allah. More than 600 of these visions were written down, becoming the sacred text known as the Quran, or Quran. By 613 Muhammad had attracted followers with his messages of one God, Allah's power, the duty of worship and generosity, and the doctrine of the Last Judgment. Followers of this new religion became known as Muslims, an Arabic word meaning those who submit to Allah, and the religion itself became known as Islam, meaning submission. Today, there are Muslims in every part of the world, but the largest Muslim communities are in the Middle East, North Africa, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Central Asia. Additionally, most of the people of Turkey and Albania are Muslim. It is the world's second largest religion, after Christianity.
What is a prophet?
Most broadly, a prophet is any person who tells what will happen, but in a religious context. Prophets are people who preach what they believe has been divinely revealed to them. In this way, they are seen as instruments of God and are thought to possess profound spiritual and moral insight. Moses was a Hebrew prophet, as were Isaiah and Jeremiah, among others. Muhammad was an Islamic prophet, and Christians regard Jesus as a prophet. The Bible, Old Testament, also warns of false prophets. In other words, prophets who do not speak the truth. For example, Deuteronomy 13:1-3 says, "Should a prophet or a peddler of dreams appear among you and offer you a sign or portent, and call on you to go after other gods whom you have not known and to worship them, of not heed the words of that prophet or dreamer."
When did the first Africans arrive in the British colonies of North America?
In 1619 a Dutch ship carrying 20 Africans landed at Jamestown, Virginia. They were put to work as servants, not as slaves. Though they had fewer rights than their white counterparts, they were able to gain their freedom and acquire property, which prompted the development of a small class of free Negroes in colonial Virginia. For example, there is record of an Anthony Johnson arriving in Virginia in 1621 as a servant. He was freed 1 year later, and about 30 years after that he imported 5 servants himself, receiving from Virginia 250 acres of land for so doing.
What areas of the United States did Hernando de Soto explore?
Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto, c. 1500 to 1542, ventured throughout the southeast before he caught fever and died along the banks of the Mississippi River, having been part of a brutal expedition that crushed the Inca Empire. In what is now Peru, in 1536 de Soto returned to Spain a hero. But he sought to go back to the New World and got his wish when King Charles I, 1500 to 1558, appointed him governor of Cuba and authorized him to conquer and colonize the region that is now the southeastern United States. Arriving in Florida in the winter of 1539, De Soto and an army of about 600 men headed north during the following spring and summer. In search of gold and silver, they traveled through present-day Georgia, through North and South Carolina, through the Great Smoky Mountains, and into Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. After defeating the Choctaw leader Tuscaloosa in October 1540 in south-central Alabama, the Spaniards headed north and west into Mississippi. They crossed the Mississippi River on May 21, 1540, and De Soto died later that same day. Since he had shown no mercy in his conquests of the native peoples, De Soto's troops sunk his body in the river so that it would not be discovered and desecrated by the Indians. Then his army continued on without him. Under the direction of Luis de Moscoso they reached Mexico in 1541.
What is the Ark of the Covenant?
According to Judeo-Christian tradition, the Ark of the Covenant is a decorative box that holds the tablets containing the Ten Commandments, also called the Law. The Ark was constructed by skilled craftsmen in Sinai. It was made exactly to God's specifications, which are first mentioned in the Bible in Exodus 25:10-22. The Israelites carried the ark with them into the Promised Land, where King Solomon, 10th century BC, built a permanent temple to house it. When the Babylonians captured Jerusalem in 586 BC, the ark was either destroyed or taken. If it survived, its location is a mystery that has intrigued scholars and archaeologists, as well as popular culture. However, some scholars believe the ark never really existed.
Who were the apostles?
The apostles were 12 men chosen by Jesus Christ, c. 6 b.c.c. AD 30, to be his close followers. The apostles helped spread the word that they believed Jesus to be the Son of God. Matthew 10:1 explains that Jesus gave the 12 authority to drive out unclean spirits and to cure every kind of illness. In Matthew 10:2-4, the names of the 12 apostles are given as Simon Peter, who is later simply called Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. But the lists of apostles found in Luke 6:13-16 and in Acts 1:13 differ from that found in Matthew. While both Luke and Acts cite Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, they do not name Thaddeus, but rather Judas the son of James. In other words, the lists agree on 11 of the 12 names. After Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus Christ, Matthias was chosen by the apostles to take his place, This is described in Acts 1:21-26. He was considered eligible since, like the 11 remaining apostles, he accompanied Jesus from the time of Jesus's baptism until the day he was taken up from us.
What happened to the tablets on which the 10 Commandments were written?
Chapter 32 of the book of Exodus explains that while Moses was up on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the Israelites who were waiting below grew impatient, and soon prevailed upon Aaron to make us a god who will be our leader. As for the man Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. And so Aaron did what the people wanted. He proceeded to collect gold jewelry from the Israelites and then fashioned the jewelry into a golden calf. When Moses came down the mountain, he saw the people rejoicing and dancing before the calf. Enraged, Moses threw the 2 tablets, which were inscribed on both sides, to the ground, smashing them. Later, the Bible explains, in Exodus 34:1-4, that God instructed Moses to carve new stone tablets like the other ones, which he did. These tablets were placed in the Ark of the Covenant, as God had told Moses. People sometimes see the 10 Commandments as divided into 2 groups. The first group covers the relationship between people and God, and the second covers relationships among people.
What were the Swedish colonial holdings?
The Swedish possessions consisted of a small colony called New Sweden. Established in 1638 at Fort Christina, present-day Wilmington, Delaware. The Swedes gradually extended the settlement from the mouth of the Delaware Bay, south of Wilmington, northward along the Delaware River as far as present-day Trenton, New Jersey. The settlers were mostly fur traders, though there was farming in the colony as well. In 1655 the territory was taken by the Dutch in a military expedition led by Director General of New Netherlands Peter Stuyvesant, c. 1610-1672. For 9 years the territory was part of the Dutch colonial claims called New Netherlands. In 1664 the English claimed it and the rest of New Netherlands. Delaware was set up as a British proprietary colony, which it remained until the outbreak of the American Revolution, 1775-83. New Sweden was the only Swedish colony in the Americas.
What is Golgotha?
Golgotha is the Hebrew name for Calvary. The site on a hillside outside ancient Jerusalem where Jesus Christ, c. 6b.cc AD 30, was crucified. Though the exact site is unknown. It is believed to be where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located.
How was Cortés able to claim Mexico for the Spaniards?
On behalf of the European power, Hernán Cortés, 1485 to 1547, claimed Mexico after conquering its native peoples. In 1519 Cortés landed on the eastern coast of Mexico and founded the city of Veracruz. From there he marched inland, making an alliance with the Tlaxcalan Indians, who had fought wars against the powerful Aztecs in central Mexico. On November 8 of that year, Cortés marched into Mexico City, then named Tenochtitlan, and took the Aztec leader, Montezuma, hostage. Cortés then continued to Mexico's west coast. When he returned to Mexico City in the central part of the country in 1520, he found the Aztecs in revolt against the Spaniards. Fierce fighting ensued, and by the end of June Montezuma was dead. This period of warfare is still remembered today by Mexicans as La Noche Triste, the sorrowful night. It was not until the following year, in August 1521, that Cortés, after a 4-month battle, claimed Mexico City, and the land came under control of the Spanish.
When were the major waves of immigration to the United States?
The first wave of immigration was during colonial times, when most new arrivals to North America were from England. But other European countries were represented as well, including France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Wales. By 1700 roughly 250,000 people lived in the American colonies. By the beginning of the American Revolution, 1775 to 83, the number had climbed to 700,000. Some of these new arrivals had been encouraged to immigrate by Virginia's head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies also adopted the head right system, with the land amounts varying in each. Other immigrants in this first wave were poor and could not afford the price of the transatlantic passage. By signing a contract agreeing to work as an indentured servant for a period of typically 3 to 7 years, their fare was paid by their future master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. During the American Revolution and for several decades after, the flow of immigrants into the new country slowed. A second wave of immigration began in 1820. During the next 50 years, nearly 7.5 million newcomers arrived in the United States. Many were Irish who escaped the effects of the Great Famine back home, settling the cities along the eastern U.S. seaboard. An equal number, roughly a third, were German, who settled the nation's interior farmlands, particularly the Midwest. An economic Depression in the 1870s stemmed the tide of immigrants, but only for a short time. Between 1881 and 1920 a third wave brought more than 23 million immigrants to American shores. These new arrivals were largely from Eastern and Southern Europe. German immigration reached its peak in 1882. In 1883 the United States saw the peak of immigration from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and China. Just after the turn of the century, in 1902, U.S. immigration set new records as people from Italy, Austro-Hungary, and Russia made the transatlantic journey. Between 1920 and 1965 immigration slowed. In the last 3.5 decades of the 20th century and into the 21st, a fourth wave of immigration has taken place. In spring 1998 the U.S. Census Bureau released a report citing that 9.6% of American residents are foreign-born, or roughly 1 in every 10. This is the highest percentage reported since the 1930s, when 11.6% of U.S. residents were natives of another country, a result of the third wave of immigration, 1881 to 1920. However, the origin countries have shifted. Latin Americans now account for about half of all new arrivals. 1/4 are Asian-born, and 1/5 are European.
When were the major waves of immigration to the United States?
The first wave of immigration was during colonial times, when most new arrivals to North America were from England. But other European countries were represented as well, including France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Wales. By 1700 roughly 250,000 people lived in the American colonies. By the beginning of the American Revolution, 1775 to 83, the number had climbed to 700,000. Some of these new arrivals had been encouraged to immigrate by Virginia's head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies also adopted the head right system, with the land amounts varying in each. Other immigrants in this first wave were poor and could not afford the price of the transatlantic passage. By signing a contract agreeing to work as an indentured servant for a period of typically 3 to 7 years, their fare was paid by their future master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. During the American Revolution and for several decades after, the flow of immigrants into the new country slowed. A second wave of immigration began in 1820. During the next 50 years, nearly 7.5 million newcomers arrived in the United States. Many were Irish who escaped the effects of the Great Famine back home, settling the cities along the eastern U.S. seaboard. An equal number, roughly a third, were German, who settled the nation's interior farmlands, particularly the Midwest. An economic depression in the 1870s stemmed the tide of immigrants, but only for a short time. Between 1881 and 1920 a third wave brought more than 23 million immigrants to American shores. These new arrivals were largely from Eastern and Southern Europe. German immigration reached its peak in 1882. In 1883 the United States saw the peak of immigration from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and China. Just after the turn of the century, in 1902, U.S. immigration set new records as people from Italy, Austro-Hungary, and Russia made the transatlantic journey. Between 1920 and 1965 immigration slowed. In the last 3.5 decades of the 20th century and into the 21st, a fourth wave of immigration has taken place. In spring 1998 the U.S. Census Bureau released a report citing that 9.6% of American residents are foreign-born, or roughly 1 in every 10. This is the highest percentage reported since the 1930s, when 11.6% of U.S. residents were natives of another country, a result of the third wave of immigration, 1881 to 1920. However, the origin countries have shifted. Latin Americans now account for about half of all new arrivals. 1/4 are Asian-born, and 1/5 are European.